Good afternoon. Welcome to our afternoon plenary featuring the brilliant Dr. Courtney Howard. I'm Rebecca Graff-McRae. I'm the research manager at Parkland Institute, where I've been since 2015. Some of you may have the wonderful pleasure of hearing me speak about the crisis in healthcare tomorrow morning, which I guarantee you will be as depressing as it sounds. However, as much as we like to talk about crises, we also like to talk about optimism, action, moving forward, having a vision and a plan, and I think that's all the aims that we want to have today in our session as well. I think all of us, perhaps here in Alberta especially, felt the cognitive dissonance of this past May, watching a provincial election campaign take place amidst the most severe wildfire season in our national record, much less here provincially and in other provinces, in which neither of the two contending parties seemed to recognize, certainly not acknowledge, the links to climate change, the impacts to people's health and well-being, or any of the deeper connections that we were hoping would be made in that time of emergency. And so I think that's something to bear in mind as we sit and reflect on the talk with Dr. Courtney Howard here today, who will be presenting Summer of Smoke and Fire, which is now the fifth George R.R. Martin book. I know we've all been waiting for it. Just as much chaos and catastrophe, but far more hope and optimism, I'm hoping. Summer of Smoke and Fire, Climate Change, Health, and the North. So Dr. Courtney Howard is an emergency physician in Yellowknife's Dene Territory, a clinical associate professor at the University of Calgary, and a community research fellow in planetary health at the Dadale Institute for Global Health, the vice chair of the Global Climate and Health Alliance, and she has recently, just this past week, completed a master's degree in public policy at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford. So congrats, first of all. Her studies there have been focusing on the next steps towards economies built around well-being. Dr. Howard's clinical work over the past 15 years in Canada's subarctic and Arctic, as well as internationally and in parts of the global south, is what I would summarize, it's difficult to summarize such a body of work, but would say is varied, intersectional, and certainly urgent in these times. Her work there is also built towards connecting to policy work and advocacy. She also is represented on a number of important professional bodies, including she was the first woman president of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. She sits on the board of the Canadian Medical Association and the Communications and Advocacy Subcommittee of the WHO Civil Society Working Group on Climate Change and Health. And amongst all of her other roles, when not in the ER or deep in a literature review, she can be found dancing with her two young daughters on the shores of Back Bay. And I think that's such a beautiful image to lead us into this talk here today. Please welcome Dr. Courtney Howard.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here. And I know you think you came to a climate change talk, but you're actually going to get to see all of my daughters dancing on Back Bay. So as long as the video works. I am an emergency physician in Yellowknife's Dene Territory. I went north as a new medical graduate, and I wanted to work with Doctors Without Borders. And they said, if you want to work for us, you need to go north, you need to work in a remote environment. We want you to get used to working with less resources. So I said, okay. And I went as a resident, I went again as a locum, and right before I was preparing for my mission, my first mission, I went again, and I hadn't remembered a book. And actually, I was in Edmonton, in this airport, in my giant parka, like running, sweating, and I realized I had no book, and it was December in Inuvik, and it's not a place you want to be without a book. So I picked one up, and I had about 30 seconds, I was late for my flight, and I just picked up a book about climate change. And it was simply because I had spent my entire 20s in study carrels, and I couldn't talk about adult things at cocktail parties. At all. It was embarrassing. And so I thought, oh, that is a thing adults talk about. I will learn adult things. And so I picked it up And I read it on my way up and got increasingly alarmed. They hadn't taught me about climate change at medical school, but they did teach me how to read a graph and how to do a literature review. So I got off the plane, I ditched my bags. I'm an emergency doc, so we tend to act quickly when we are alarmed. And I did a literature review. And I happened to pull up the Lancet Commission's first report on climate change and health, which said that climate change is the biggest health threat of the 21st century. So this was hot off the presses at the time. It was 2009. The Lancet, as you know, is probably the most or one of the most prestigious medical journals. And this statement occupied the prime real estate. The single quote that gets to be on the front of the Lancet, that was where I saw that the climate change is the biggest health threat of the 21st century. And I looked up, the only place with decent internet at the time was in the Emerge, so that's where I was. And I asked the Emerge nurse, did you know that climate change is the biggest health threat of the 21st century? And she said, no, but you know, my cousin went through the ice on the way to his trap line this fall, and that doesn't usually happen. And you know, the trees are all tipping over because the permafrost is melting, and it's making it very difficult for us to hunt and to fish, so there's food security challenges. And all of this is making us really sad. And so right there, because I happen to have what I would refer to as a climate awakening moment in one of the most rapidly warming places in the world, I went straight from a lack of awareness to a, oh my goodness, this is a health emergency. And when I get excited about things, some of you have met me before, I tend to tell everybody. So basically, picture me walking around for the next 6 months, like, did you know that climate change is the biggest health threat of the 21st? And I luckily said that to the right person. Not too long afterwards, I was at the Family Medicine Forum in Calgary, actually, and said that to a friend, Courtney, who just took one look at me and walked me over to the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment table and introduced me to one of their founding presidents, Warren Bell. So I was really, really lucky to go from a moment of real worry and lack of connection to meeting my people almost immediately, and that was a huge gift. So I've been involved with the Canadian Medical Association of Physicians for the Environment for almost 15 years now. We'll be going as a team to the climate change negotiations in Dubai in a couple of weeks. So just when I tell you information now, when you feel worried about it, because it is a really worrisome diagnosis for all of us. And these are impacts that impact not only each one of us, but each of our family members, everyone we love, and really has a lot to do with what we're going to do for the rest of our lives. So there's an issue of alignment of purpose, of realignment of purpose, of finding your new mission in the light of this information. And so when you feel that way, when you feel nervous as I'm talking, remember you're already in a room, lucky you, with some of your people. So you've already, in walking here, taken your first step, and that's a real gift that not everybody has. So this was the picture I took, actually, right after learning this. I was flying between Inuvik and Aklavik, which is a little town in essentially a sandbar in the middle of the Mackenzie River. And I want to take this opportunity to point out, because I didn't know this, that the water goes north. I was just in the middle of looking at the map in the doctor's lounge, actually in Inuvik, and being like, oh my God, thank God I didn't say that out loud, because I realized that I had been sort of picturing if you flicked water at the map, it would roll down. And that's, I think, why I thought it went the other way, but it does go north, and that matters, because this whole thing is downstream of the oil sands. So that entire epic body of water, Athabasca, Great Slave Lake, this Mackenzie River all the way up to the Arctic Ocean. And so what happens here has a huge impact on what happens where I live. I went to work thinking that I wanted to optimize health. I always wanted to help people. That was sort of my nature. And I thought, okay, if I want to help people be healthy, I'm going to go work in the hospital because that's where health is generated. As I was speaking with Paul Kershaw about the determinants of health, I now know I needed to completely reframe how I viewed health. And so I now think about everything being interconnected, and I view this in a similar way to the way I think about treating people. So we all get to walk around in this complex, self-regulating part of nature every day, and when I go to the hospital and I work and I give somebody a drug, I have to make sure that if I give a drug that's going to target the heart, that I think about what that might do to the kidneys, and I also think about what that might do to their brain. So you have to really take everything into account and recognize there's a lot of feedback loops in these amazing systems that we get to walk around in. I have been humbled by my work with these systems. So I did go on a mission with Doctors Without Borders. I resuscitated small people between the ages of 6 months and 5 years for 6 months in Djibouti in a slum with severe acute malnutrition. Now, when a child has severe acute malnutrition, what that looks like is they're completely immunocompromised. So if you've ever had a friend go through cancer treatment and end up severely immunocompromised, just totally frail, that's what little people with malnutrition are. So basically they get a cold and they end up with overwhelming sepsis. And so it's a lot of sepsis, a lot of resuscitation, a lot of epinephrine, a lot of CPR, and a lot of death. I had never had a child die under my care as an emergency physician in Canada. I saw one when I was training in Montreal. We ran a code for an hour, and the attending physician at the Children's Hospital went home afterwards because she was so upset. And the first time a child died under my care on this table that you see here, I felt like the bottom was falling out of the earth. I put my head back. I felt like there had been things I could have done that I wasn't able to do. We didn't have a ventilator. This whole project, most projects like this around the world don't have ventilators. And so when you get to the point where you need a ventilator or you would need complicated ICU type machinery, that's all you could do. And so I swore, I sat down, I swore actually on the word, then realized I had to get up and get back to work because we still had 50 other kids to see. Over the course of my time there, as I started to realize that Djibouti is an extremely hot place, the temperature was regularly 40 degrees Celsius or more. This was not a climate-induced malnutrition emergency, but they have had multiple climate-induced or amplified malnutrition emergencies since. So I realized at some point, after another child died under my care, and I just realized that I said to myself I would do everything I could for the rest of my life to prevent this type of death. I eventually put it together that if climate change is the biggest driver of this type of death, I probably should go home and work on climate change. And so that's what I did. You know, we talk about decolonizing global health, we talk about decolonizing planetary health. Retrospectively, that was essentially what I was saying I wanted to do because, as you know, Canada has one of the biggest per capita carbon footprints in the world. And so I, by then, realized that as a white woman who didn't speak Arabic, I wasn't going to make a ton of change in Djibouti. However, I speak one of the official languages, the other one halfway decently here. I've trained here, I understand how power systems work at least a little bit, so probably my best opportunity to make change in service of global health was right here. And I've been trying to figure out how to do that ever since. And so I now think about the Earth as a complex self-regulating system that we get to walk around on every day, and the Earth has its own organ system. So the way this is conceptualized in the literature, the best framework, I think, is called the planetary boundaries framework. So it essentially looks at about 9 different organ systems. And just like our organ systems, our heart, our kidneys, our brain, what happens to one affects what happens to the other. So you have to kind of think about what's going to happen to any given area when you act on the other. So unfortunately, of the 9 organ systems, these planetary boundaries, 6 of them are kind of unstable. 2 of the core ones, biodiversity and climate change, definitely are. So those are the ones that are considered to have the most impact on the rest of them, and so those are the ones that we're really thinking about a lot. How do we use this in policy? As was mentioned, I spent this last year at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford, which is super fancy and is inhabited mostly by social scientists. So that was the first time in my life I had done formal training with social scientists. And meanwhile, I'd spent most of my life before that with natural scientists, medical people, and dancers, if you can believe it. And I'd always felt kind of odd going back and forth between dance and science. You know, I was always the nerdy person in one room or the like overly creative person in the other room. And what I realized as I was trying to make change within those communities was that we frankly suck at making change. And I don't know if you would agree with this, Paul, but as doctors, we're not trained well, at least as clinicians, how to make societal change. And scientists, generally speaking, aren't trained in communications. They're not trained in power at all. We tend to walk around with an unconscious, what we call information deficit model of change making. And actually, one of Paul's grad students did an incredible paper on this. And in fact, I got her to be an external reader on a paper I did, as we try to figure out how to help scientists get better at getting their research, which is critical, into public policy. And so that's why I went to Oxford. And then I got there and realized that they were not briefed at all about the ecological determinants of health. So I got to, because of the access you get there, you can sidle up to Nobel Prize winning economists and be like, psst, have you ever had a briefing on climate change? And they're like, no! And you watch them drink 2 glasses of wine before that. So you're pretty sure they're being honest with you. And you're like, holy crap, that's not good. And so I think our challenge right now is to meld these two communities, the people who have some of this really, really critical information about our ecological foundation that we need to keep this self-regulating Earth stable, with the people who actually know how to make change in the social sciences and the power structures where, you know, humans are the actors that are really in charge of them, and how do we get those together? So the thing that I have found to be the most helpful is thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals. How can we achieve those within the planetary boundaries framework? How can we essentially provide a good life for all without exceeding what the planet can provide? And if you'll notice, this is starting to look a lot like the donut. So put up your hand if you've ever seen this image. When you think about it, this is incorporating so many things that we need to be talking about. I was really honored this year, actually, to get to meet Kate Rayworth and help her put on a course because she got so upset with the economists for not knowing anything about the scientists. So we're just like crankily doing super nerdy academic interventions, but this is where the world is at. So if you're thinking, I'm just sort of like learning about how all of this intersects, well, that's where everybody is right now. A planetary health aligned approach to policymaking aims to do that. And why I think that frame is so helpful is because it allows us to maximize co-benefits and synergies, because you're checking for positive effects between the social sciences and all the different scientific ecological ones. You're looking to avoid bad side effects. You don't want to tank your biodiversity if you're doing something with the climate, and you're looking to avoid conflict. What is this? How does this all intersect with these summers of fire that we've had? So I now think of planetary health and health as existing within a planetary health nest that has ecological foundations that are absolutely necessary for us to then build the social and structural fabric of society. So these things that a lot of the people at the conference are talking about: housing, education, healthcare, et cetera. And because, what we all do is the most important thing in the world, the hospital, I believe, sits at the top of that. And when you think about what is required, the elements of stability that are required in all of those underpinnings in order to staff and supply and build the infrastructure associated with healthcare, you start to realize that in order for a surgeon to show up in the operating room on Monday morning and have the tools they need to do their work, all of the underlying layers need to be intact. And finally figuring out to explain it that way is how I managed to get this onto the strategic plan of the Canadian Medical Association without it ever having been an agenda item, because they didn't see themselves as environmentalists. So if you're looking for a way to try to bring a new community on board, this is the best way I have found. When the climate changes, our ecological foundation starts to change. So you can see here, these are just some of the elements. So sea level rise, water shortages, actual extreme heat. And that changes the patients who present to emergency departments. So we start to see heat emergencies, wildfire emergencies, changes in infectious disease, malnutrition, as we talked about, and all of that can become a driver for conflict as well as for migration. How is this looking? How's this showing up in our backyard? So this is my backyard. When we got back this year, this stage that we see here was once a dock. My kids were swimming off of this before we went to the UK. So you can see, you could tap dance on that sucker, and that's really the only thing it's good for right now. The water levels are so low, so part of this has to do with Site C Dam getting filled up, because again, that's upstream, but a lot of it just has to do with drought. And so when we think about what that means, that starts to drive this fire weather that we're seeing. So I actually went and stood in the parking lot at Fort McMurray at one point in their emergency department parking lot. You can see burned out trees in 2 directions from that parking lot. That was a close call. This happened in Yellowknife 2 years earlier. So PM 2.5, particulate matter less than 2.5 microns, is the element that is tracked most often in studies around wildfires and smoke. NWT, we usually have pristine air quality outside of fire season, so our average is usually about 6. WHO likes to see it under about 30. That's what that pink line is. You can see that in 2014, we were just way, way over that. And the time scale at the bottom, that's 2.5 months. So this was terrible air quality, and at the time, it was really one of the worst recorded ones in the global evidence base. So we did a study. It had a quantitative and a qualitative part. We showed a full doubling of emergency department visits for asthma. This is a small population, so that's a huge effect. And we did 30 community-based interviews, partnering with the Yellowknives Dene and the Kakatu First Nation to ask them, how did it feel to live through that? And so people told us that they felt isolated from their family and friends because they were staying inside with the windows closed. They got super squirrely from the lack of physical activity. And when we think about the treatment benefit of physical activity, so, as an emerge doc, I prescribe physical activity for pretty much anything. You come into me with high blood pressure, I'm like, take a walk 5 times a week. You come in depressed, take a walk. I mean it. It's like the only thing I can tell you to do that has all the side benefits that are good. Like, it's just goodness all around. If you could package physical activity, you would be the most high-grossing pharmaceutical company in the world. So, there's an idea for y'all. But you can imagine, so people were staying inside, so not only were they like cabin fevering, but they had lost that treatment benefit without really realizing it. A lot of people said something like, if it's this bad now, what does this mean for my kids? So an expression of ecological grief or worry. And to just say that that is a totally normal response to a real threat. If we were standing in the middle of the road, each of us holding one of our children in one hand, and a truck was barreling down on us, you might want to take one deep breath to make sure you ran in the right direction. But yoga breathing is not going to solve your mental health distress at that moment, right? You have to actually decrease the threat to you and the people that you love. And so you have to get out of the way, right? And so ecological grief, ecological distress, these are normal reactions to a real threat, and we ought to be processing them in the same way as we process other types of grief that demand both us to find our center and then to find an action plan. That was really well expressed by the people in the study. The thing that I loved the most about the final theme was the people who prepared the most felt the best. So the people who fire smarted their homes, who knew what the evacuation plan was, who led the community activities in the clean air shelters so the kids could come in and run around, they sat up straight in their interviews, they looked proud, they looked like they felt in control of the situation. So what we learned from that is that preparation not only practically does good, but it feels good. And that is one of the real reasons why it's worthwhile to kind of confront this diagnosis, go through the grieving process, and then make a plan, because that is going to feel so much better than this sort of like horrible, oh dear, we got to do something feeling, which is where I think our public conversation is for the most part right now. This is just a small picture of me getting to serve dinner to my ultimate hero, James Orbinski, which was one of the more nerve-wracking things I've ever done in my life. There was no fish in town. I wanted to make fish chowder. He was the international president of Doctors Without Borders right before I did my first mission, and so he was like medical duckling me. This was my ultimate hero, and trying to make him dinner was quite something. Other effects from wildfire smoke, we know that they're actually starting to be shown to increase cardiovascular risks. So if you feel chest pain or shortness of breath during a wildfire episode, don't just discount that. Go to the emergency department. It's an inflammatory pathway, so these teensy tiny little particles can get all the way down into your bloodstream and cause an inflammatory cascade, and that's why the effects aren't just sort of breathing related. It's because they go all the way into your pathways. One study now showing increased potential for both lung cancer and brain cancer. This is new. This is only one study. However, when we think about the effects of fossil fuel-related air pollution, we know that those definitely have been shown to increase different types of cancer. So essentially, it is worth our while to properly decrease our exposure and our risk. The NWT this summer, unfortunately, the smoke was terrible for even longer. We had 3 seasons worth of smoke this time. We haven't done the studies yet. We're writing up the grant proposals. This was on my deck, and the PM 2.5 was over 500. It was terrible. And of course, this spread all across North America, and we had to evacuate our 100-bed hospital. So I was actually in Ottawa doing a keynote at the Canadian Medical Association Health Summit on this exact topic as my best friends were evacuating our 100-bed hospital. And I was looking out at the crowd knowing that most of those doctors had never had a lecture on climate change at all, because this is only still now just getting into curricula. So how do we reduce our risk from this in a practical way? N95s are our friends. These can actually, a properly fitted N95 mask can reduce your exposure to particulate matter by over 90%. So it's worth it to get them. making sure that your air filtration devices inside your home are filtering out the smoke that seeps in, making sure that you open up your windows to let the smoky air out when it's nice outside, going outside to get some exercise, exercising inside your home if you need to, and really, really putting pressure on your elected officials to make sure that your clean air shelters are functioning and accessible to everybody. And actually, I think Edmonton, I believe that you have already added this to your emergency plan, and there's an automatic threshold at which it opens up for free to people. So congratulations, that's really forward thinking. Most people, most jurisdictions don't have that yet. So other effects, BC heat dome killed more than 600 people. And heat illness, again, this isn't just heat stroke, it increases stressors on all sorts of cardiovascular, et cetera, risk factors. So there's quite a few impacting. And as with so many of these things, it disproportionately impacts people in lower socioeconomic areas, people who can't seek shelter, whose homes don't have good ventilation or air conditioning. And so much of this is about trying to figure out who the vulnerable people are in your community and how we can take care of them during these episodes. Floods also can really displace people. There's PTSD, et cetera, associated with being displaced from your home, real socioeconomic hardships. And it can disrupt healthcare. This was a picture I took, a screenshot of a day I went to work in the emergency department in Yellowknife, and they told me I actually couldn't medevac anybody because all the planes were grounded because we were about to have to evacuate Hay River Hospital. Hay River has been evacuated 3 times in the last year. So I was having dinner with some people at home, and they're like, everyone in Hay River has PTSD. You know, that is certainly not a quantitative, no one did a study to say that, that's the feeling around town. And so how do we keep ourselves in good mental and physical spirits? We really have to be thinking about all of these elements of the planetary health nest, housing disruption, supply chain disruption. The thing that really starts to worry me is destabilized government, right? So how many times can you evacuate a area? How much money can you pour, how many billions can you pour into that before your institutions themselves start to sort of fray? And you can actually already sort of feel it in the NWT right now. You can feel, everybody feels like we have to really come together and lean into community, lean into institutions, lean into relationship building, because you can see when, you know, so-and-so left and then so-and-so never came back, and then that store that you relied on for whatever it was is closed. Things start to fray, right? And so this is the worry. Now, healthcare practitioners themselves, you know, they were tired, they're stressed, all of this was additional stress. So thinking about your actual workforce, working through this as well as your infrastructure is pretty important. I think a lot about pharmaceutical supply chains. Now, I actually, and this is a good crowd to probably say this, I think we probably need to start purpose-driven production of pharmaceuticals in Canada, whether that's through a crown corporation. Wow, I'll tell people that was popular. Yeah, we're actually starting, a small group of docs are starting to talk about this now because it's already not working. We've had supply chain disruption, acetaminophen shortages, just simple drugs, anything with a low profit margin, we're just not getting them. It's not working. It's gonna work less well. You know, we can no longer hand over a perfect climate to our children. We can hand over a stable pharmaceutical supply, and frankly, that is one of my real focuses for the next 5 to 10 years of my life. So this is our planetary health nest. These are the things we need to be thinking about, and you can see how the social sciences, all elements of the labor movement are absolutely key to helping, as well as everybody who is trying to keep the ecological foundations stable. And I gotta tell you this, so the natural scientists really need your help, because we're still operating, we're still annoyed with people that they're not going onto PubMed to read our 8-point font papers. Right? That are behind a paywall. We're like, why have you not processed the information that is behind a paywall in my 8-point font paper with no graphics? Like, clearly this is your fault. We need help. So it's really important to realize that we're not at a new normal. I get this question a lot from media, and it tells me that people don't understand. So under every modeled pathway, we're gonna continue to warm until at least 2040 and after that. So the blue line there is our best case scenario. This is when some grieving may need to take place. It means that the fires are gonna keep getting worse. You need to anticipate that. But what that also means is now you know what to invest in. If you've been sitting there thinking to yourself, is it worth my while to put time into buying a or to lobbying my city hall for better clean air shelters? The answer is yes. If you're asking yourself, is it worth my time or my money to buy myself some air filtration devices? The answer is yes, okay? And what I've found, interestingly, is that if you put numbers on this in terms of kids, Matthias is actually a little guy who got evacuated out of Fort McMurray. People don't do math very well in their heads, so if you make it clear that, he's only going to be 22 in 2040 when Canada is about 2 degrees Celsius warmer than we were during a 1986 to 2005 baseline. Like, these are the kids, if you care enough to be brushing your grandkids' teeth or your kids' teeth, you need to be working on this. Canada's National Adaptation Strategy was launched last year. It's good. And the problem is we just need to now figure out ways to implement it. So I was on the disaster resilience table, and we had no actual conversations with anyone on the health and well-being table, and there's no mechanism right now for this to be actually implemented via Health Canada into our health systems, et cetera. And so heading into COP28, that's actually one of our main asks of the federal government, is to start to fund a proper secretariat to help us do that. Now that we've talked about adaptation, and as you're speaking with different audiences, I would actually encourage you to lead with adaptation because it's so practical. If you ever looked at, I actually watched the parliamentary debate after the heat dome, some of the best points were made by the most right-wing politicians. They're people who are used to delivering on concrete goals. They want to take care of their friends and family. It's about community. And they had really very, very strong, purposeful questions and good ideas for action plans. And the thing is, once you've thought through adaptation and how am I going to actually, keep whatever intact in my community in those circumstances, then you ask them, do you want to be on the red line that's continuing to warm through to the end of the century? They're like, heck no. Okay? And so part of it is a nice way to ask people to just figure out how they would actually cope with it. And the obvious answer is, well, we're not going to be able to adapt to the red line, so we need to urgently mitigate. So it's an interesting time in terms of mitigation. We are at a point of multiple tipping points, and they're in opposite directions. So a tipping point is a place where once you go past it, you kind of can't go the other way. The whole system readjusts to the new reality. And so we're at that tipping point within the climate system. Unfortunately, there's several that are soon to be triggered, and we're going to talk about that. Clean technology, it's just getting cheaper in almost every jurisdiction, even for new builds, to supply it with clean electricity as opposed to fossil fuel electricity. And we're slowing that progress down with fossil fuel subsidies. So how can we accelerate that instead? And meanwhile, mainstreaming of planetary health within the health sector and beyond, so people actually understand this and connect these dots and are starting to understand sort of where to exert pressure. So the balance of these tipping points, this is going to determine, I think, the future of what our well-being looks like in Canada in the next 5 to 10 years, and really for every generation that comes. Imagine, you are alive at a moment of tipping points. Not everybody has the ability to know that the effort that they exert right now has that kind of impact. I went into emergency medicine because I wanted to be able to work at the place where I could have the biggest impact. And it just happens. We're all now in a climate emergency where we have the ability to have an impact that lasts not only for our whole lifetime, but for everybody who will live beyond. If you're looking for meaning in life, it's an incredible time. It matters that we stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. That you go to political things, you read through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, there's all these graphs. The bottom line is we do not want the tipping points to start. We don't want the permafrost to start to melt, because once the methane gets released, all of this gets much less, we're much less able to influence it. Okay, so it is time for a mitigation sprint as well. And this is how they're graphically representing those tipping points. We don't want to end up in that red sink. And I got to tell you, September was worrisome. We were 1.75 degrees Celsius warmer in September than during that pre-industrial baseline, and you can see how much of a difference that is compared to previous Septembers. And when you think about all the greenhouse gas emissions that were emitted during all those huge wildfires, we're starting to get into this place of positive feedback loops, and so we got to move. So the OECD policy department actually did a paper on tipping points last year, and basically they were like, plan for adaptation, mitigate as quickly as possible. So it's not, is climate going to change? Do we need to adapt? It is adapt. It is clearly happening. Forecast that out, pay for it, get it organized, and then mitigate. And so it's totally normal to be feeling a little worried at this point in the presentation. And so I'm just going to play a video. This was to Jay Gilday's song, and yeah, Jay Gilday is amazing. And we were lucky to film him in the melting snow castle in Yellowknife.
We must move rapidly to a low-carbon economy, even before I die. Some people find this uncomfortable to hear. How do you feel about it?
In the days that move a little faster than light, and I see that the feeling is right. Gotta tell what I feel in my heart. And I love you, wake a little more every day. But the leaves, they blow and decay, while I grow a little farther from you. Well, I see your path, see your light. Need a little push to it right. Gotta feel the pain to push on through.
I was honored to be able to premiere that at the WHO presentation at COP. And what I loved about watching my community in this international community was realizing that it is community that is going to get us through all of this. It is knowing your neighbors, it's having relationships with them, it's knowing who can show up to dance on a Sunday, who can provide childcare for that, who has the ability to have a drone, who knows how to get the person who has the drone out of bed on a Sunday. So all of that stuff that actually is easier in a small community sometimes than a larger community, that's how we take care of one another during wildfires. That's how we make a plan that works for everybody. And so just thinking about leaning into community. And of course it's fun, right? Like that's what life's about. How do we lead this change? You know, we've been leaving it to politicians to lead the change, but really, will you jump and try something a bit scary for someone you don't trust? Probably not, right? And so this is why I spend a lot of time mobilizing the health sector. It's because health sector workers tend to be amongst the most trusted across the world. And meanwhile, politicians are not trusted at all. Some of you know I ran for the leadership of the Green Party, and I felt that. You know, all of a sudden you say things nobody listens to. I'm like, screw this, I'm retreating from politics. This is no good. You can see that a different year lists hairdressers. They're about 6th. Teachers are way up there. Essentially, people on the street are far more trusted than politicians. And so when you're thinking about how to create change, I get a lot of people asking me this, is it about individual work or is it about community work? It's everything. Individual, community, national, all pointing in the same direction, recognizing that your influence is not just the carbon under your control, it's the impact and the influence you have on others. So what you do matters because you have an influence on the people who know and care about you that I don't have. So we could be 2 of us in a room and say the same thing, and the people who know you are gonna trust you and do what you say far more than me. And so that's one of the reasons, think about your influence as rippling out from what you do. Now, healthy energy is an important part of it. These are some of the mitigation options that improve health right now. So fossil fuel related air pollution is thought to impact up to 1/5 of all global deaths. So basically, anytime we reduce fossil fuel related air pollution, we reduce deaths, reduce hospital visits, reduce kids missing school from asthma, reduce adults missing work to be with their children in the emergency department when they have asthma, reduce healthcare costs, et cetera. So really, it's a huge, huge opportunity. So we're aiming to make people healthy now via the same measures as we need to use to decrease greenhouse gas emissions. And so some of the main ones are healthy energy, healthy transport, active transport. Cycling actually reduces mortality. And getting out into nature. Melissa Lem is a wonderful colleague of mine, has been leading the Park RX movement. And so getting out into nature for 2 hours every week can actually improve your feelings of well-being, and connecting to nature makes you love it more, and you're much more likely to take care of it. Also, inputting nature into urban areas can reduce the urban heat island effect. So if there's trees breaking up an otherwise horrible asphalty parking lot, that can actually reduce the temperature by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, which is life-saving in heat emergencies that we know are coming. So you want to put those trees in there. Trees also decrease noise pollution. They actually filter the air themselves with their leaves. And creating habitat gives all the mammals and the bugs that could otherwise transfer diseases to us a chance to have their own place to live. I like to picture them over there doing their own thing and not giving me any viruses, okay? Because that's actually the vast majority of novel infectious diseases that we've had over the last couple of decades have come from that mechanism. There's been an animal that had a disease that we were able to get, gave it to a vector, ended up with us, and that's how we get all these, H1N1, et cetera, okay? We don't want any more of those. Let's give them a place to live. Lots of benefits. Plant-rich diets, really, they decrease the land associated with your diet, the water associated with your diet, as well as the greenhouse gas emissions associated with their diet, and they're also quite healthy for you. We're lucky. Jane Philpott really did us a solid. She put up her sharp elbows and said, no, we are not going to have closed-door meetings with the food and beverage industry while we develop the food guide. So we actually have an evidence-aligned food guide. This is a public policy miracle, really. Like, if you ever see Jane Philpott, I feel like she doesn't get nearly enough credit for this. I'm like, I still can't believe she managed to get this done. But when you talk to people, and I was having meetings in bars with people, like this is around Ottawa at this time, they were telling me that she was just utterly fierce. So what if we took that same approach to decision-making around fossil fuels, right? So have her in to tell you tales about her policy wins, because I think that's incredible. Empowering girls and women with access to the sexual and reproductive health care that they tell us that they want, as well as education, decreases mortality, maternal mortality, childhood mortality, increases educational attainment for the family, increases the power of women within families, which gives them more of an ability to run for office. And bodies of parliamentarians with a higher proportion of women are actually more likely to vote for education, healthcare, and the environment. And BC actually just made birth control publicly accessible. It's the first province. There's practical steps we can take in that direction. Cleaning up healthcare itself matters because we are responsible for about 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, as well as we allocate 10% of global world product. What if we got organized? We can tip markets, and we're starting to. So the Academic Health Institution's Declaration on Planetary Health is a sign-on in Canadian medical schools that we're actually launching internationally in The Lancet on Tuesday, asking institutions, universities, and hospitals to commit to doing this work. And we've got all of the medical schools in Canada, except for Jane Philpott's, because she wants to put pressure on her medical school to divest before she signs up. So, this is an interesting strategy. I can't, cool. I can't argue with her. What that allows us to do is take this 10% of global world product and use it to buy clean energy-related transport, make sure that we only source clean electricity, as well as decarbonize the pharmaceutical chain. This is my friend Nick Watts. He's in charge of decarbonizing the NHS. He showed up at COP26 with his zero emissions ambulance and parked it like a shiny toy in the parking lot. And then we all walked back and forth. And by the end of it, we'd managed to have 50 countries sign up to this WHO program on resilient low carbon health systems. And it was one of these times where you realize that leadership matters. Leadership goes viral. That's what happened. I watched it happen at an international level. And it was because Nick showed up. with a zero emissions ambulance. So be Nick. Like, show up with something, make a big move, make sure everybody knows about it, make a time-limited sign-on, put social pressure on people. That's what really moves the dial. Planetary health diet and healthcare really can decrease the footprint of your healthcare diet. There is a clean food pledge that hospitals can take within Canada. And imagine having, like they do in Taiwan, therapeutic gardens associated with hospitals so that people get the benefits of nature, have local sustainable food, and make sure that their local supply is much more resilient. So we're talking about empowering women. And when you look at the donut and think about empowering women, I just went through and was like, what does this make better? What does this make worse? What's the same? Wow, look at all of that. And you can do that with any policy measure. How does it affect everything in the donut? Just map it out. It's quite a fun thing to do. So now our world is starting to look like this. And in fact, everything we've done is just making life better right now. This is a place where you want to live. This is a place where communities are green and connected. And we make sure as well that we transfer to natural gas, away from natural gas inside our houses as well, put our money to work where it can count, and make sure that the fossil fuel industry doesn't get off the hook. Part of that declaration involves signing on to the call for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, and I would like you to know that we launched a sign-on at the Global Climate and Health Alliance for this. We got hundreds of thousands of healthcare professionals to sign up. That allowed the WHO, the social license, to sign up, which they did, and that's what's happening in that photo. And then the European Parliament and multiple countries started signing on. So what I have learned through all of this is that it's about leadership. And of course, here in Canada, some of the most incredible leaders have been Indigenous peoples who've been telling us this forever, you know? It's not about ego, it's about eco. And at this moment, this is a time where we need to stand up for and with them. We still haven't done decent studies into the local health impacts of the oil sands. This is probably my area of greatest shame as a member of the Canadian medical community. I'm in active plotting to stop this right now, but voices from Alberta saying, hey, it's not fair that we've got this going on in our backyard. We still don't even know what the health impacts of those oil sands are. We have the ability to do this research. We've got some of the best biomedical research capacity in the world here. We just need to fund it. We need to stand up to the people who aren't going to want to have it happen. We need to get access. We need it to be community partnered. And then that will give us the data so that the elders can stand up with actual data behind them and say what's happening. And that gives us the power to start to change things properly. And this was the last study done that basically said to do that. It was done in 2014. That was almost a decade ago. What is the healthcare community doing to move us towards a well-being economy? We did a sign-on asking for the Prime Minister to prioritize that. We got pretty much all of the big NGOs in Canada to do it. And just leaving you with this thought that came from the WHO Council and economics, policymakers must actively create and shape an economy that delivers on goals that are critical to human and planetary well-being. All of us are working towards planetary well-being. And what I kind of love about that is it gives us all the ability to know that whatever we're doing is in service of planetary healing. I know I stay up in the middle of the night sometimes when I want to be in bed because I want to be healing and helping. And I think sometimes when people are a little bit farther away from the bedside, it's hard to feel like what you're doing is in service of that. But the more we connect these dots, the more we realize that each one of us working on any layer is working on healing, and that is in service of everyone now and everyone into the future. So thank you so much for everything that you do, and I'm very much looking forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Howard. I know there were a few moments there where you created just this textured silence in the room here. I think around that concept of being at the center of these tipping points and also being very much in that moment of power to change. And I think those are such important emotions to acknowledge and hold in tension, that the urgency, but also the agency as well. So thank you so much for that amazing talk. Thank you. We have a goodly amount of time to open the floor up for some questions.
You mentioned you grabbed that copy of the climate change book because this is what the adults were talking. Unfortunately, that's not what I see. Nothing deadens a conversation in my house or in my community by bringing up climate change. And I think as it was pointed out in the introduction here in Alberta, and climate change was lacking from both parties. What can we do to make this conversation really happen?
That is true, and I've certainly shut down my fair share of dinner parties and had more than one person duck into the bathroom when they see me coming. Have you ever seen that happen? You're like, look, you went, I saw you. You did that last time too. And so it's real. And so one way I think about this is that I view it as a diagnosis. So when someone comes into the emergency department and they tell me they're short of breath and I do a chest x-ray and I'm thinking I'm just gonna find a pneumonia or something, and it's something different. It's something that looks like cancer, it's something that looks like TB. I know that no matter how I relay that information, the person is not going to be happy. And having done that many times now, I've been in practice for almost 15 years, I know that there's a real range of normal human emotions. So sometimes people get angry at me, shoot the messenger. Sometimes they just look guilty depending on what the circumstances are and they kind of don't want to talk. Sometimes they start to laugh, just crack jokes. Sometimes they get up and they leave. Sometimes they have a ton of questions. So number one, recognizing that this is a normal human reaction to difficult news and having compassion for that. I think sometimes we get really angry, but our impatience is actually not generally the most strategic emotion. Before I go into those rooms in the emergency department, I make sure I've eaten. I make sure I already went pee. If I'm cranky about something, I take like 3 minutes to center myself because I know that it is my job to be as centered as possible within that conversation so I can be as strategic and attentive to them and the message they need to hear as I can. And so part of it is knowing that that's normal and then figuring out a way through it. So in that room, we're all oriented around that person's health. Like what I've learned from being with people around the world and certainly around Canada at 2 a.m. on the worst day of their lives is what everybody really wants is to be safe and to be healthy. And they want their kids to be safe and to be healthy. And when you think about what the narrative has been around climate change, certainly in Alberta, but I think broadly, it's been around graphs, like CO2 levels, it's been around taxes. It hasn't been around health. It hasn't been around the things that people really, really care about next Tuesday or now. And so really recognizing that this is a health emergency and making those connections as much as possible and then citing, like I think of that donut as a North Star. Like this is where we're going because people are scared about the diagnosis and the plan has not been clearly communicated to them. And what I find in the trauma room, for instance, if a very sick patient is wheeled in, the moment of highest tension and uncertainty is before we name a diagnosis and before we make a plan. So once we name the diagnosis, even a provisional diagnosis, and we say, I think this person is having a heart attack, we are going to immediately start treatment for that. Jody, this is your job. Please do that and come back and talk to me. Arthur, can you please do this and come back and talk to me? George, please do this, come back, talk to me. Everyone's got their job. They go do it. The level of anxiety goes, thunk. So right now, we're at a moment where we need to say true things. I think the best thing that we can do is really focus it around well-being. How is this affecting our well-being now in all of those layers of the planetary health nest? And what are we looking for? How can we cite that North Star of a well-being-oriented economy that prioritizes health now and into the future? And I think that once we start talking about that, especially leading with adaptation, because it's not political health. And it's not, and actually that's what the communications evidence also says. So there's been quite a bit of communication studies done around this and presenting climate change in a health frame and then pairing your messages of impact with a message of opportunity. So, let's phase out, different types of power in order to decrease air pollution related deaths. Those are the most appealing messages across the political spectrum.
My name is Jerry McDonald. I'm a registered nurse from Northern Alberta. This topic speaks very much to me and my family because we were very nearly impacted by some of the evacuations and things that happened this past May. And I'd like to tell a little story that brings a glimmer of hope to the doom and gloom that has been part of the conversation about climate in Alberta for quite some time. We live in Grand Prairie, but we don't actually live technically within the city of Grand Prairie. We live in a technically rural subdivision in the county that surrounds the city, also called the County of Grand Prairie, by the way, just to be exciting. We don't actually, it's not far from the city. We live a golf course away from city limits, so it's not very rural. There was an area just on the other side of the main highway that was evacuated due to fires lots of acreages and whatnot that were evacuated. And we were like packing our stuff, being ready for the evacuation order because we were worried it would jump the highway and we'd have to leave. Very alarming, very disturbing, stressful. My wife was freaked out, anxious and everything else. It kind of calmed down, things improved, the fires were controlled. One of the things that's coming out of that whole experience in our neighborhood, and this is a neighborhood in a fairly conservative community, what they've decided to do, so our subdivision has these restrictive covenants on our land that dictate the kind of roofing material we could use in our homes. The community has gotten together to approach a lawyer to go to court to amend the restrictive covenants to allow for fire smart roofing materials. This is in
Awesome.
Grand Prairie.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah.
That voted absolutely religiously for the United Conservative Party, and yet they are taking. So when you mentioned adaptation, and you also talked about conservatives buying into the adaptation concept, I think that's the case in point. So I thought I'd share that. Again, I think it's a little glimmer of positivity amidst some of the negativity we're hearing.
Thanks, that's really helpful. My grandma actually lived on a farm in southwestern Manitoba until she was 99 and a half, as a result of her neighbors taking care of her. And again, this was in a conservative riding. I think we need to be really inviting and welcoming as the impacts become worse. There's going to be a lot of people who are like, whoa, I was a little bit off here for a while. And they are going to be trying to find the courage within their friends and family circle to open the conversation, to becoming more climate aware. And we're going to have to be like, yes, come, let me help you. How can I help you? How can I be more of service to you in making this transition? And so highlighting that kind of a story, really celebrating that, like making muffins and going to take them to people, it really, really matters. This is about rejoining in community, and a lot of it is place-based and local in this sort of digital world, and that there's a real beauty to that.
We're seeing the beginning of a small movement to move away from the use of the term natural gas because it is a lie. There's nothing natural about this stuff. The proponents of this movement propose that we use the term fossil gas. I would like to propose that when people see or hear the term natural gas, they correct the user. And that's one little thing we can do to make the world better. Thank you.
Yeah, that's good. I usually actually do use that term, but I hadn't. Thank you for the reminder.
It might also help if we tell them what the fossil is that's in it. It's methane. And it's a worse greenhouse gas in the short term than CO2.
Yeah, absolutely. Methane over a 20-year time span has about 80 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. Even coal-fired power, if you track the amount of methane from extraction all the way to burning it for electricity, it's so leaky and it's so potent, it's actually not better than generating electricity via coal-fired electricity, which is a giant misunderstanding right now, so something important to point out. I do actually think it's super important to be clear. A lot of people, I actually had a Conservative MP over for tea this week. We talked about this, and he actually just didn't know. And I mean, if you're not sitting there reading Mark Jacobson's work from Stanford, why would you know, right? It's not in the media. So again, being gentle as we help people understand better, I think is important.
Is that I can't believe that the fossil fuel industry doesn't know what's in fossil.
Oh, I think they know. There's a real difference between the people at the top setting the narrative and the people who are sort of transmitting the narrative and part of the system lower down.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I'm a retired English teacher, and language is so important. No more right-wing think tanks, they're shrink tanks. When you start with your conclusions, you're not doing research. There's all kinds of places where they take over the language. Natural gas, transition fuel. And then when you read what we've read recently too, and you realize that LNG, liquefied natural gas, is a worse killer than coal in many instances. And so let's push Ling. Let's have a new industry that makes short-term money for a few liars. And we got to call them liars. Because if they don't know what's in that stuff, they shouldn't have risen so high in the business. You know what I mean?
There's definitely, I think, different approaches for different audiences and different people in the food chain, for sure.
I wanted to ask Dr. Howard about the 2014 study that you referenced in your slides as well, whether you can tell us a little bit about any lessons that were drawn through from that in terms of that sort of policy perspective, and whether you found any of that sort of painfully learned experience being put into play over this last summer?
The clean air shelter elements were really, really important, which is why I was so impressed with Edmonton for having clean air shelters identified and also already having a trigger to make sure that your recreation centers are free after a certain number of hours of poor air quality, because most places in Canada don't have that yet. Just for reference, I was getting texts from good friends who've been doctors for over 15 years. Courtney, what's the air quality health index? What we know from curriculum surveys that I've helped to design is that only about 15 to 20% of doctors in Canada have ever even had a lecture on air pollution. That's where we're at, because this has been in our blind spot for so long. So if your doctors never talk to you about this, it's because they haven't come to one of my talks yet. But I'm making them, because I made all their med students, or all their medical schools sign on. So we're really at a time of rapid change of onboarding docs. I've actually done now similar work in curriculum change with engineers and with economists. We did an open letter at Oxford as well, calling for changes to the economics curriculum there. So if you have an affiliation with any faculty, really, it'd be kind of interesting to head in, like, are the teachers being taught a planetary health lens? Do they understand how their work intersects with this? Do the engineers upstairs here, have they got a planetary health lens? Based on the curriculum surveys I did with an engineer friend of mine, they probably don't. And that matters, because they're building the hospitals. I did a series of webinars with some architects, and we surveyed the audience, and most of the architects didn't know where our temperature and precipitation projections were going. So whoever you're working with, whatever your role, do your best to help the people around you understand that this is our reality, because we need every single skill set weighing in with a real knowledge of where we're heading.
I have a few friends who are in climate science research, and there's a lot of technology, but there's not an easy way to get into the market with that technology. So I'm wondering what the intersections there are in order to help the technology that already exists, like, move into the existing marketplaces.
Yeah, so that's making introductions across silos, right? It's one of the reasons why I think we need a well-being oriented economy. So when you look at the Department of Finance, they've actually done quite a lot of the work required to do this now nationally. They've got a quality of life framework. And so when you look at what's happening in New Zealand, they've already started making their budget decisions based on that. So they decide which of those elements of well-being they want to optimize every year. And then they get the different ministries to co-pitch ideas that they think will optimize those, and they have to work between ministries, and once they get all those pitches in, they decide what they're going to fund with the budget. And because they've got metrics that go beyond GDP, all of a sudden we're starting to dedicate our resources, our joint resources, our tax dollars, our policy power, to things that actually really will help us live well through all of the instability that we're going to see. GDP doesn't work as a measure of well-being beyond a certain level. If you were going to design a study for national well-being, that would never be your outcome measure. And so we've actually done the work to create the outcome measures, and now we need to create the structures that allow us to connect those silos. And once we do that at that level, it'll be much easier to fund that kind of a thing, but you can still do that work on a local level. So introduce your friends to the local MBA students. Say, hey, I've got an idea for your next startup. Can you lend your skill set? Go talk to the communications department. Say, hey, what's your pitch for the best narrative to sell this? Go talk to the poli-sci people and say, when's the next election, and how do we leverage that to get this new thing that we now have a good business case for, a narrative for, funded? So it's really about de-siloing at all levels. And so can you create that in your university? There's some good programs. Is there a think tank around that you can sort of bring that idea to? Do we need to merge think tanks? I've been wondering that. All of this, all the way up. The cool thing is it's just fun work, right? You get tired of talking about what you talk about with the people you talk about. This way you're like, wow, that's what it's like in engineering? Cool. You'll learn a lot. So I think it's actually not only a useful way to spend a life, but a really fun way to spend it.
One of the things that hasn't been mentioned so far is the media, the things that people in the community at large, get every day, whether it's newspapers, it could be online platforms. Of course, then there's the think tanks, the books that we read, whatever. But what about this public discourse and how it's influenced by the larger public media and online platforms? What's your sense of this, and in some ways, what is your place in it as you feel, and maybe we'd have a clue of what our place might be. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
I was lucky to do my first interview with a friend in a really small media market in Yellowknife. And that was a gift to me because I wasn't very good, because I was your typical science doctor person who says way, way, way too many things too fast using big words. So part of this is making sure that the people who have the messages that need to be heard actually get that training. So I now do actually a lot of advocacy training and a lot of media training and storytelling training with doctors and scientists to help them get better at that, because we're not taught to do it. And when you think about the people in your high school class who went into sciences, it wasn't usually the most like extroverted human there. But we saw from the messengers table that it matters that it's actually the scientist delivering the message, right? So we need to make sure that all of our messengers, all of our people who have an important message are trained as messengers, and that actually takes practice. And when we look at that communications as a skill set, it makes it clear that you can give training. It's not a God-given, well, I mean, for some people it is. Certainly, it's easier for some people than others, but everybody can get better with practice. So that was part of my program last year, was they ran media training for everybody. That was just, they're like, obviously, we're a school of policy. You're gonna need to talk to the media. We need to do that in a lot of other places, anybody who wants to influence policy. So number one, our messengers need to be trained. Number two, you know what, honestly, as this is getting worse, the media is coming for the message. So I did at least 50 interviews this summer. I think I did more. I was on pretty much every national outlet at least twice, to the point where that actually takes a toll on the messenger. We were at the point where I was basically having to be very focused on taking care of myself in the middle of giving what was essentially bad news over and over and over. But what you realize is that that is a real gift, because you are able to be with people in that sort of moment where they're in distress in the same way as I can in a clinical room. And so just like I have to sleep well if I'm working between emergency shifts, I have to sleep well if I'm doing a lot of media, so that I can still be that sort of centered human heading into that. And so what we're seeing is the media themselves, like I've done cognitive behavioral therapy on many, many national journalists at this point who are just having their moment of, well, it's true. They're all terrified, the poor weather people. Imagine. Right? You're the person who has to talk about the smoke every day. I was like, by the end of the summer, I was like, it's okay, we're gonna get through this, right? And so thinking about the journalists, they're working under deadline. They're actually there's a lot of pressure on them. So being ready with our messengers for when those moments hit, and having an action plan that we can tell them, because scientists they're not trained in policy, right? So if you got a climate scientist on there without a policy person with them, or without them having been trained in policy, they're like, yeah, it sucks. But that might not be their area of study, right? They need a policy action plan in order for that interview to feel hopeful for the most part. And so making sure that we help them do that as well. And so I think that's one of the reasons why, if I can take all these scientists I talk to all the time and just merge them with all the people in the public policy schools, wow, and the communication schools, we're gonna have much, much better outcomes. And so I think it's really, really part of de-siloing and working together.
If we are going to speak about what's happening with the fires, that we write down for ourselves what we think we want to say and practice it, because we don't hit all the points. We have to do our own homework too. Thank you.
You know what, that's it. It's identifying that it's homework and doing the homework and helping people if they haven't yet done it. CAPE now has an advocacy and mobilization training program. We're putting through our second cohort this year. Our first cohort went out and had so many meetings that they actually got us a meeting with the cross-party climate caucus on Parliament Hill. These are people who had never done it before. But with a little bit of training, they showed up, and there we were. The Council of Canadians has really good experience in organizing. So, go knock on the door of the climate scientists and say, hey, can we help you? I suspect that they could use that help. All right, thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Huge thank you, Dr. Courtney Howard, for our plenary.